The Ghost of the Gilded Age, the man who built the impossible. The Hook. In 1869, the city of New York was a chaotic hive of mud and horse manure, divided from Brooklyn by a river so treacherous it was known as the Gateway to Hell. People said a bridge across it was impossible, an act of defiance against God and gravity. But one family decided to build it anyway. By the time the Brooklyn Bridge was finished, the father was dead, the son was paralyzed and confined to a room, and the entire project was secretly being run by a woman whose name history almost forgot. This is not just a story of steel. It is a story of madness, decompression sickness, and the invisible woman who built the icon of the American dream. Chapter 1. The Visionary's Curse. The wind off the East River didn't just blow, it bit. In the summer of 1869, John Augustus Roebling, a Prussian-born genius with a face carved from granite, stood on a pier in Brooklyn. He was surveying the site for what would be the longest suspension bridge in human history. To the American public, Roebling was a wizard. He had already harnessed the power of twisted steel wire to span the Niagara Gorge. But the East River was different. It wasn't just a river. It was a tidal strait with currents so unpredictable they could crush a ship's hull against the rocks. "It cannot be done," the newspapers screamed. The skeptics claimed the wind would catch the bridge like a sail and snap the towers. They claimed the cost, $15 million in 19th century dollars, would bankrupt the city. Roebling didn't care for skeptics. He cared for physics. While standing on that pier, lost in his calculations, a docking ferry slammed into the pilings. The heavy timbers shifted, crushing Roebling's foot. In an era before modern medicine, this was a death sentence. True to his stubborn, eccentric nature, Roebling refused conventional treatment, insisting on water therapy, pouring constant streams of water over his mangled toes. Within weeks, lockjaw set in. Tetanus paralyzed his throat. The man who had spent decades dreaming of the bridge died before the first stone was even laid. The project was left to his son, Washington Roebling. Washington was a Civil War hero, a man who had looked death in the eye at Little Round Top, but he was about to face a monster far more terrifying than the Confederate Army, the Caisson disease. Chapter 2. The World Beneath the Water. To build the massive stone towers of the bridge, Washington Roebling had to do something unprecedented. He built 2 giant, bottomless wooden boxes, caissons, the size of several tennis courts. These were sunk to the bottom of the river. Men, known as sandhogs, went inside these boxes to dig out the riverbed until the boxes sank deep enough to hit bedrock. Imagine the scene. You are 70 feet underwater. The air is pumped in from the surface, thick with the smell of sweat and kerosene lamps. The pressure is so intense that your voice sounds like a high-pitched squeak. If you whistle, no sound comes out. The heat is unbearable. Washington Roebling lived down there with his men. He didn't just supervise, he dug. But then the men started getting sick. Upon returning to the surface, they would collapse in agony, clutching their stomachs, their joints locking up. Some went blind. Others died in convulsions. They called it the bends. At the time, no one understood that nitrogen bubbles were forming in their blood because they were surfacing too quickly. One afternoon, Washington was carried out of the caisson, his body broken. He survived, but he was left a permanent invalid. He could no longer walk. He could barely talk. He was sensitive to light and sound. The Great Bridge was now a leaderless ghost project. The public assumed it was over. The impossible bridge had claimed the father and crippled the son. Chapter 3. The Secret Engineer. From his bedroom window in Brooklyn Heights, Washington Roebling watched the river through a telescope. He was a prisoner in his own home. But he had a secret weapon, his wife, Emily Roebling. In the 1870s, women were expected to manage households, not multi-million-dollar engineering feats. But Emily was different. She became Washington's hands, his eyes, and eventually his brain. She began by taking notes to the construction site. Then she began explaining his instructions to the engineers. Realizing she needed to understand the work to communicate it, she began studying higher mathematics, the calculation of catenary curves, the strength of materials, and the complexities of cable spinning. For the next 11 years, Emily Roebling was the unofficial chief engineer of the Brooklyn Bridge. She dealt with crooked politicians from Tammany Hall who tried to steal the bridge's funding. She managed the disgruntled workers. She visited the bridge towers every day, carrying the heavy blueprints under her arm. The men on the site began to whisper. They realized that the orders weren't just coming through Emily, they were often coming from Emily. Chapter 5. The Inferno in the Deep. By 1870, the Brooklyn caisson had settled into the riverbed, but the New York side was a nightmare. The sandhogs were digging deeper than ever before. As they pushed further into the muck, the pressure required to keep the water out increased to terrifying levels. Then came the night of the big blowout. A candle, left unattended by a weary worker, ignited the yellow pine roof of the New York caisson. In the compressed, oxygen-rich environment, the fire didn't just flicker, it roared like a furnace. Because the wood was saturated with gas and under immense pressure, the fire didn't stay on the surface. It ate its way into the massive timber beams, glowing deep inside the wood where no hose could reach. Washington Roebling, still somewhat mobile at this stage, spent 7 hours straight in the compressed air fighting the fire. He eventually ordered the entire caisson to be flooded with millions of gallons of river water to extinguish the hidden embers. When they pumped the water back out, the damage was horrifying. The fire had hollowed out the support beams. If the roof collapsed, the East River would rush in, drowning hundreds of men and causing a vacuum seal that would shake the very foundations of Manhattan. Roebling's solution was pure desperation. He ordered the men to inject liquid cement into the charred cavities of the wood. It worked, but the stress of that night, the rapid decompression and the smoke inhalation was the final blow to Washington's health. He would never set foot on the bridge again. Chapter 5. The King of New York and the Shadow of Corruption. While the sandhogs bled and burned, a different kind of predator was watching the bridge. William Boss Tweed. Tweed was the head of Tammany Hall, the political machine that ran New York City with an iron and incredibly oily fist. To Tweed, the Brooklyn Bridge wasn't a feat of engineering, it was the world's largest piggy bank. Tweed became a major shareholder in the bridge company. He ensured that every contract for granite, timber, and steel went to his friends at triple the actual price. Kickbacks flowed like water. It is estimated that Tweed and his ring stole nearly $200 million from the city during this era. However, the Roeblings were men of Prussian integrity. Washington Roebling, still somewhat mobile at this stage, watched through his telescope from his sickbed, began to notice that the steel wire being delivered for the main cables was brittle. It didn't meet his father's strict specifications. He sent Emily to investigate.
she discovered a massive fraud. A contractor named J. Lloyd Hay was sneaking rotten wire into the loads, hiding the bad coils beneath a layer of good ones. The scandal threatened to shut down the project forever. If the public found out the bridge was being built with inferior steel, there would be a riot. Roebling's solution was pure desperation. He ordered the men to inject liquid cement into the charred cavities of the wood. It worked, but the stress of that night, the rapid decompression and the smoke inhalation was the final blow to Washington's health. He would never set foot on the bridge again. Chapter 6. The Woman Who Spoke for the Silent. By 1875, the towers were complete. They stood like Gothic cathedrals in the middle of the water, the tallest structures in the Western Hemisphere. But the chief engineer was invisible. The Board of Trustees began to panic. They hadn't seen Washington Roebling in years. Rumors swirled that he had gone insane, that he was a vegetable, or that he was already dead and his family was hiding the body to keep the salary coming. This is where Emily Warren Roebling stepped out of the shadows. She began attending the board meetings. At first, the men ignored her, but then she began to speak. She didn't speak like a mourning wife. She spoke like a master engineer. She cited the exact tension limits of the stay cables. She debated the logistics of the approaches. She stood before the American civil engineers, the first woman ever to do so, and defended her husband's designs with such technical precision that the room fell silent. Back at the house, he and Washington had developed a private language. Because he could barely move, he would tap out messages on her arm, a precursor to a sort of tactile Morse code. She was his nervous system. Every day, Emily climbed the iron stairs of the towers. She walked the narrow footbridge, a single plank of wood suspended hundreds of feet above the churning river, to inspect the cable spinning. The workers began to salute her. They called her Mrs. Chief Engineer. Chapter 8. The Spinning of the Web. The most spectacular part of the construction was the cable spinning. 4 massive main cables, each 15 inches thick, had to be woven together from 5,000 individual strands of steel wire. A giant wheel traveled back and forth across the river, carrying the wire. It was a rhythmic, mesmerizing dance of industrial power, but it was deadly. If a wire snapped under tension, it acted like a whip, capable of decapitating a man instantly. As the cables took shape, the bridge began to look like a giant harp. The people of New York and Brooklyn would gather at the shore just to watch the spiders, the workers crawling across the steel webs in the sky. But as the bridge neared completion in 1883, the political vultures returned. They wanted Washington Roebling removed before the ribbon cutting so they could take the credit. They called for a vote to strip him of his title.
Emily didn't sit at home and pray. She went door to door to the homes of the city's most influential leaders. She lobbied, she argued, and she shamed them. When the final vote was cast, the motion to remove Washington was defeated. The invisible engineer would keep his bridge. Chapter 8. The Day the World Crossed the Water. May 24, 1883, was a day the sun seemed to rise specifically for New York. It was declared the People's Day. Shops were shuttered, schools were closed, and the harbor was choked with every vessel, from luxury yachts to rusted tugboats. Even the Atlantic Fleet of the U.S. Navy stood at attention, their brass cannons polished to a mirror shine. The President of the United States, Chester A. Arthur, arrived to walk the span. Alongside him was the Governor of New York, Grover Cleveland. As they marched from the New York side toward Brooklyn, the air exploded. 14 tons of fireworks were launched from the towers, turning the midday sky into a kaleidoscope of sulfur and fire. But the real hero was not on the bridge. Washington Roebling sat in his armchair at 110 Columbia Heights. His telescope was trained on the promenade. He could see the tiny figures of the president and the dignitaries, but his eyes were searching for one person. Finally, he saw her. Emily Warren Roebling was the first person to cross the bridge in a carriage. In her lap, she carried a rooster, a symbol of victory. As she drove across, the workers who had spent 13 years in the muck and the wind broke their ranks and cheered until their voices went hoarse. That night, for the first time in history, the cities of New York and Brooklyn were joined by a necklace of light. The newly invented Edison electric lamps that lined the bridge, glowing like fallen stars above the Black River. Chapter 9. The Screams on the Promenade. The honeymoon lasted exactly 6 days. On May 31st, 1883, Decoration Day, the bridge was packed with families. It was a humid afternoon, and thousands of people were strolling along the elevated wooden promenade, enjoying the breeze. Near the New York Tower, a woman tripped on a narrow set of stairs. Another woman screamed. In that instant, a collective madness took hold. A rumor spread through the crowd like a lightning strike. The bridge is sinking! The cables are snapping! Panic is a physical force. The crowd surged forward, people trampling over one another to reach the exits. The narrow stairways became bottlenecks of death. Men climbed the iron trusses to escape the crush, while women and children were pressed against the railings until the wood groaned. When the police finally cleared the bridge, the scene was grisly. 12 people lay dead, their clothes torn to rags. Hats, parasols, and shoes were piled inches deep across the promenade. The bridge of hope had become a bridge of mourning. The public's trust was shattered. People looked at the great stone towers not with awe, but with suspicion. They whispered that the rotten wire Washington Roebling had worried about was finally giving way. Chapter 10. The Parade of Giants. The bridge needed a miracle to reclaim its soul. It needed a showman. Enter P.T. Barnum. The legendary circus mogul saw an opportunity for the greatest publicity stunt in American history. He approached the bridge authorities with a proposal. He would prove the bridge was safe by crossing it with his most heavyweight performers. On May 17, 1884, a strange sight emerged from the shadows of Manhattan. Led by the world-famous Jumbo, a 7-ton African elephant, a procession of 21 elephants and 10 camels began a slow, rhythmic march across the span. The crowd held its breath. If the bridge could hold 21 elephants, over 100 tons of concentrated walking weight, it could hold anything. Jumbo led the way with a majestic, steady gait, his trunk swaying. As the last elephant stepped on the Brooklyn soil, the city erupted. The fear was gone. The bridge was finally, truly, part of the American landscape. Chapter 11. The Invisible Architect's Legacy. The bridge changed everything. It turned Brooklyn from a separate city into a borough of the growing metropolis of New York. It proved that steel, not iron, was the future of the world. But for the Roeblings, the cost was total. Washington Roebling lived for many more years, a recluse in his home, still haunted by the bends he contracted in the caissons. He outlived Emily, the woman who had been his hands and his voice. Emily Warren Roebling did not stop after the bridge. She went on to earn a law degree, travel the world, and fight for women's suffrage. Yet, for decades, history books barely mentioned her. They spoke of the father and the son, but they ignored the woman who stood on the windy towers when the men were too sick to lead. Today, if you walk the Brooklyn Bridge, you will find a small plaque. It honors John, Washington, and Emily. It is a testament to the fact that the greatest icons are not just built of stone and steel, but of secret sacrifices and the silent strength of those who refuse to let a dream die.
the Brooklyn Bridge remains a masterpiece of 19th-century engineering, a bridge built on a foundation of rotten wire, political corruption, and a love story that bridged the gap between the impossible and the eternal. Epilogue: The Echoes of the East River. Even now, over 140 years later, engineers say the bridge is stronger than many modern structures. Why? Because John Roebling, in his paranoia, designed it to be 6 times stronger than it needed to be. He knew men would be greedy, he knew the wire might be weak, and he knew the wind would be cruel. He built a bridge that could survive humanity itself.